Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and this is part one of a three-part series on the role of Spiritism in the Mexican Revolution. With me is C.M. Mayo, who is the author of Metaphysical Odyssey into the Mexican Revolution, Francisco I Madero's secret book, Spiritist Manual. She has also written a novel based on a true story, The Last Prince of the Mexican Empire. In addition, she has edited an anthology called Mexico, a Traveler's Literary Companion, and several other travel books, Miraculous Air and Sky Over El Nido. Welcome, C.M.
I'm delighted to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you and to explore an important episode in human cultural history that's often been ignored. You sort of encountered it by chance, I gather, when you visited a private library in Mexico.
No, it was not a private library. It is a public, it's an archive in Mexico's National Palace. Mm-hmm. This is the Francisco I Madero archive. It's open to researchers, and the catalog is online. Anyone can Google that up and have a look at that. What I had was a private tour. Mm-hmm. And in the private tour, I saw many different things, Masonic regalia, photographs, letters, all sorts of things. And then there was this little book.
Now, before we talk about that little book, we should say that Francisco Madero is regarded by many people as either the founder of the Mexican Revolution or a very important contributor to it.
He was the leader of the 1910 revolution. Mm-hmm. So he formally pronounced the 1910 revolution. He became president in 1911, ruled briefly as president, and he was overthrown in a coup d'etat and murdered in 1913, at which point the revolution continued for several more years. Mm-hmm. When exactly it ended is a matter of debate among historians, which date they want to take, which episode they want to take, but it ground on for another decade or more. Mm-hmm. But clearly, although there are many other actors in the revolution, he was the leader of the 1910 revolution.
This is the revolution that overthrew the dictator Porfirio Diaz, who had been in power for 30 years.
He had been in power a very long time, and I think he celebrated his 80th birthday, and it was clear that there was not a transition in place that was going to make sense. Yep. And so Francisco Madero, who was a businessman from the north of Mexico, from Coahuila, which is the state that borders on Texas, he called for free and open elections with full suffrage and for no re-election. So in other words, whoever was elected would not be someone who was standing for re-election. Mm-hmm. So it had to be your president and then you're out. So he called for that, and that is in fact what happened. There were free elections after the revolution. He won, and then of course he was overthrown. But he is considered in Mexican history a very important figure. He's called the Apostle of Democracy. And he's the author of another much better known book, which is called in Spanish La Sucesión Presidencial en 1910, which would be translated as The Presidential Succession in 1910. Mm-hmm. He was calling for free elections. And when Porfirio Diaz did not grant that, then Madero pronounced the revolution on November 20th, 1910, still a holiday every year in Mexico.
Well, and there you are now in the National Palace, looking at the Madero archives, and you encountered something quite amazing.
Well, there it was, the Spiritist Manual, and by Bhima, B-H-I-M-A, and I picked it up and said, well, what's this funny little thing? And I started looking at it, and I said to the curator, "What's this?" And she said, "Well, he wrote it." And I said, "Really?" She says, "Yes, he did." And I encountered it at precisely the moment when I had published my anthology of 24 Mexican writers in translation. And I've been translating contemporary Mexican fiction and poetry really 20 years, a very long time. And so I was very familiar, painfully aware how little Mexican literature is translated compared to the body of literature that exists. In English, we are able to read very little of it. And so really as a gesture of gratitude for the tour and to the curator, just as a gesture, I said, well, it wasn't that big a book. So I said, well, if he really wrote it, and he did, it doesn't really matter what's in it. I like to tell people, if you found out George Washington in Valley Forge wrote a sacred book, it could be lists of his grandma's corn muffin recipes. It's important, okay? It doesn't matter what's in it. He's so important. The event is so important. The timing is so important. It's important. So I said, well, I'll do it, thinking...
You resolved to translate this book that had never been translated.
Yeah, it had never been translated. I thought, wait a minute, this is a huge event in Mexican history. We share a 2,000-mile border. I'm a translator. If I don't do this, nobody's going to do this.
And the title of the book was Spiritist Manual.
Manual Espírita, which I translated as Spiritist Manual. And so just as a gesture, thinking it would take a few weekends to crank it out, and I thought, oh, I'll just give it to the archive and maybe upload an electronic copy or something. But once I got started, I realized, no. This book needs context. It needs explanation. We need to retell the story with this in mind. Where did he get these ideas? It was a bit of a like plunging into the deep end of a cold pool, because it's, astral travel, talking to the dead, reincarnation, a lot of very esoteric material.
All of these ideas were in this book written by a political revolutionary, and you began to look at the intellectual history of these ideas in North America, in European culture, and I suppose in Latin American culture as well.
Exactly. Well, I should jump in and explain that I'm not the first person to write about his Spiritism. That really would be Enrique Krause. And Enrique Krause is probably Mexico's best known historian and he's a very important public intellectual in Mexico. And in the late 1980s, he brought out a book which is still in print, called Francisco Madero, Místico de la Libertad, which would be Francisco Madero, Mystic of Liberty, where he really, for the first time, brought to a general readership in Spanish the mediumistic notebooks, the corresponding, where did this idea come from? Yes. It's not a big book, it's mostly photographs. People went a little further with that. I should mention Alejandro Rosas and Manuel Guerra de Luna. They did an outstanding documentary, which you can find if you Google it up. It's on Vimeo. It's called my translation would be 1910, The Spiritist Revolution. It's a very well done documentary. Yes. And Yolia Tortolero also appears in there. And Yolia Tortolero did her doctoral thesis called El Espiritismo seduce a Francisco Madero. Spiritism seduces Francisco Madero. So I was building on the work of these other Mexican historians and taking it a little further with the translation itself into English. And also I was able to consult Madero's personal library and see some of the connections that we have with American spiritualism. But it's important to underline that Francisco Madero's Spiritism, I think for most people who study the revolution, is a kind of a hot potato. They don't understand what is Spiritism or where it came from, and it makes them very uncomfortable. And it doesn't really fit with a lot of other things. And so they're like, oh,
especially in this postmodern era, people are uncomfortable with the metaphysical, especially with Spiritism, which is often associated with fraud. The idea that we can talk to the dead it's either frightening or baffling to people, or
Right.
it causes outrageous anger that this is the rising tide of superstition, which probably is one of the social threads that led to his assassination.
Yes, I think it is, and I would like to talk about that in particular, but I think the general sort of orthodox reaction is that, yes, he was Spiritist, but let's either ignore that, throw it into a footnote, or dismiss him as a result.
Well, I think what most people don't understand is that at around the turn of the 20th century, the late 19th, early 20th century, spiritualism or Spiritism was a huge social movement,
Yes.
comparable, I think, to, maybe the consciousness movement today.
That's right. I think that's very true. And as I quickly discovered when I started doing the work I needed to do to give this book context, there's an enormous literature on this subject, and in not only of original works, but for example, Allan Kardec's books from the 19th century, which were codifying
Yes.
Spiritism as we understand it.
Kardec is maybe the seminal figure in Western spiritualism or Spiritism.
Not exactly. I would say that really it started with spiritualism, with a U in there, spiritualism in upstate New York. And then when it crossed the ocean and Allan Kardec got a hold of it, he codified it and took it a little bit further through interviewing mediums, and he put together a body of literature that we would refer to as the sort of the core works of Spiritism without the U. So in other words, Spiritism really comes from spiritualism. It's a development from that trend.
I'm still, after studying it for decades, confused about the distinction, and I don't know if it's even a real distinction, actually.
I think it gets very muddy. I think things get, and that was one of the difficulties that I encountered, was that there were a lot of overlapping. There were a lot of things that overlap with occultism, with Masonry, with Theosophy, and then Swedenborgianism, and it gets very muddy. It's difficult to make distinctions.
But it was a time of enormous social experimentation. In North America, there were new religions being founded, and in Latin America, the works of Kardec became, I know, very, very influential. The country of Brazil has even issued a postage stamp with Kardec's picture on it.
Well, another Mexican historian to mention is Jose Mariano Leyva. He wrote the history of how Spiritism came to Mexico from France in the 19th century. So when Madero encountered it, he was born in northern Mexico, in Coahuila, but his family was very wealthy. And the children,
one of the 10 wealthiest families in the country.
Kind of the equivalent of the Rockefellers of their time and place. His grandfather was Don Evaristo Madero, who owned all sorts of businesses and ranches, but the children were all sent to Paris for their education, and they also traveled in the United States and so on. So when he encountered Spiritism in the late 19th century as a student in France, it was something that had already come to Mexico. And as a matter of fact, his father subscribed to the Kardec magazine, the Revue.
I think the upper classes were particularly taken with it. I know that
some were, yes.
You mentioned the famous medium, I think, Daniel Douglas Home, or Hume as it's pronounced, who held seances with royalty all over Europe.
That's right. It was fashionable. It's important to emphasize, though, that in Mexico, the elite were Catholic, of course, and the Catholic Church prohibits this literature.
Well, the same would have been true in Brazil, and yet Spiritism is probably stronger than the Catholic Church in Brazil. And my own experience in Mexico today suggests to me that the culture is very ripe for anything esoteric.
Well, I think there's always been an interest in esoteric things, but it came with a frisson of danger, of it being prohibited. And so what people did was they met privately in private homes. It didn't have the institution of the Catholic Church or other churches, you know, with archives and a formal temple and a priesthood. It was more like people got together and they sat around a table. And at the beginning, one of the things that was very fashionable to do was to hold hands and call on the psychokinetic powers as they be, or the dead, or whatever it was, and make the table dance, the tipping tables. That was the big phenomenon. Yeah. But by the time Madero came around, a few decades after that, towards the end of the 19th century, it was more, my understanding is that different groups did different things, but he was particularly interested in developing, with the other members of his circle, developing his abilities as a writing medium. He also studied hypnotism, but that's not necessarily Spiritism.
No, and I think we should mention that there was a large amount of scientific interest. The Society for Psychical Research had been founded in both America and in England, and there were dozens of researchers exploring these seances to see if they could validate Spiritist philosophy through scientific means. And Madero's personal library included many of these books.
Well, that's a really essential point for the people who don't necessarily know anything about Spiritism, and their first reaction is one of hostility. Like, what a crackpot, what a nut. It's superstition, and in Spanish they say supersticiones, and just dismiss it. Is when you see the context and you realize, well, he considered himself at the cutting edge of scientific research, which, if you don't know anything about it, might seem ridiculous. But once you start reading, you realize, wow, as you know, William James, father of modern psychology.
One of the most influential intellectual figures in the history of the United States, was deeply involved in researching these things. He became the president of the Society for Psychical Research.
Charles Richet.
A Nobel laureate physiologist was another important researcher.
The chemist from Oxford.
William Crookes.
William Crookes.
Yes, another Nobel laureate.
Oliver Lodge.
Oliver Lodge, the co-inventor with Marconi of the radio, wrote a book about his son. Well, this was a little later, after World War I, when his son was killed. He wrote a book called Raymond about spiritual appearances of his son through different mediums.
Exactly.
So you have many, many respectable, highly intelligent, scientifically trained people who were lending credibility to the Spiritist movement.
Exactly. And one of the things that really struck me as I was reading through the history was at the time Madero encountered this literature, it was when they had first introduced the teatrophone, which was a very primitive early version of the telephone. And you could pay a coin and listen to a live performance in the opera in Paris through this apparatus. So this sense that there were things that we couldn't see that we could nonetheless capture was in the air of the time. So giving Madero context, I think, is just so crucial, and what I have tried to do. So I'm not trying to convince the reader he was right or he was wrong, or you should believe this or you should believe that, but neither should we dismiss his Spiritism as non-important to him as a political actor.
Another important aspect of his belief system was that he was very devoted to the Bhagavad Gita, the great holy book of India.
Yes, and that is something also very interesting about him. When we look at the Spiritist Manual itself, which he wrote in 1910, the year of the Revolution. He wrote the dedication in 1909, but he actually wrote the book in 1910.
Right in the midst of all of this incredible, momentous political activity, even military activity, he's writing the Spiritist Manual. That's how important it was to him.
It really was. I think he felt it was more important than his political book. He published it in 1911. But where was I going with that? I was going to make some point.
About the Bhagavad Gita.
Yes, the Bhagavad Gita. Well, if you look at the works of Allan Kardec, which were coming out a few decades before, there's a very clear influence in the 1911 Spiritist Manual by Madero. But Madero adds a lot of things,
yes,
which come from a very wide variety of reading. Many of those books I found in his library, but of course one of the most important was the Bhagavad Gita, and he was just enchanted with that. He had written many commentaries on it, publishing most of them under the name Arjuna.
Who was the hero, or one of the heroes of the Bhagavad Gita. The real hero, I guess, is Krishna, the god, but Krishna is engaged in a dialogue with Arjuna, the warrior. And Bhima, the name of the author of the Spiritist Manual, was Arjuna's brother.
Yeah, another figure in the Bhagavad Gita, another warrior from the Bhagavad Gita. So Krishna is explaining in this ancient Sanskrit literature, Krishna explains to Arjuna the nature of reality, of reincarnation, and that you must do your duty.
And Arjuna has subsequently, I would say, become the very archetype of what we mean by a spiritual warrior.
And that might include getting into an actual war. And it's okay if you die, because you can be reincarnated. So
and because the soul itself, even if you're not reincarnated, your soul is eternal.
So this was a very important text for him, and some people have jumped to the conclusion that he was a theosophist, because this was a text that was championed by the theosophists.
Now, the Theosophical Society is probably not so well known today as it was back then. It was hugely influential at that period of time.
I think it's important to say the evidence we have from his letters is that he was not a theosophist.
Okay.
But we clearly see this influence in what he was reading.
He would agree with the theosophists in the importance of the Bhagavad Gita.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think he was very interested in yoga, in all the Hindu sacred literature. I think had he lived, he was murdered in 1913. My guess is had he lived, he would have gone to India to study.
Well, he was a very high-minded person. I gather that the Spiritist Manual itself, as well as his private notebooks, are constantly full of exhortations to live the most moral, ethical life you could possibly aspire to.
Yeah, that pretty much describes it. Yeah, he started channeling automatic writing. He tried to train himself to basically channel what he believed were the dead.
Spirit messages.
And, whether that was actually what he was doing is another question.
Well, people are still puzzling over that.
Yeah.
People who watch this video series will note in my interviews with, for example, philosopher Stephen Browdy, who's looked very, very closely at this literature. He was just in here a week ago, and I asked him, well, do you believe in the spiritualist hypothesis? And he said, it just depends on what day of the week you ask him. It's an enigma.
It is an enigma. I think in constructing a narrative about it, I felt comfortable asserting that probably Madero believed that's what he was doing. The evidence certainly points in that direction. He was a member of this circle that developed these skills, that he subscribed to and also supported a number of Spiritist magazines where he published and taught himself to do this.
I'm surprised that you use the word probably. It seems almost certainly.
It certainly seems that way.
That he believed, he was sincere in his belief that he was in communication with spirits of the departed.
Well, I'm not in his head, so I can't know if he had doubts. I don't know. But
did he ever express any doubts?
Not that I know of. Not that I recall at the moment. What we have are his mediumistic notebooks, where he was channeling the messages and oftentimes sharing them with his group. And he began with a lot of messages from a brother named Raoul. And to confuse matters, he had two brothers named Raoul. One died as a child in a fire, and the other one became a very important general who lived a long life and died in the 1980s. But the child, Raoul, who had died, came back as a spirit as an adult, as a doctor,
Yes.
and who gave a lot of advice about, do the right thing, eat this food, don't drink, so on and so forth. And then later, as he continued with this practice, there were others who started showing up. One was Jose and one was BJ. Some have jumped to what seems a logical conclusion that would be Benito Juarez, but we don't know. And
Benito Juarez, who was a former president of Mexico.
Probably akin to Abraham Lincoln in terms of the importance in mid-19th century history for Mexico. And so these other later channelings were giving him advice and encouragement to launch his political career, and in particular to write La Sucesión Presidencial en 1910, the presidential succession in 1910. This book became his platform. He formed a political party around it.
It was like a revolutionary manifesto.
Yeah, it's a history of Mexico and a manifesto. And what's really interesting was that his political, and this was something pointed out by Manuel Guerra de Luna, the historian I mentioned, who was the co-writer of the documentary, that it followed the same pattern of evangelizing for Spiritism. You begin with a publication, you form circles, and then you have a national congress of the circles. But it coalesces around the book. So in a way, with the presidential succession in 1910, which was calling for free and open elections and no re-election, in a way, the Mexican Revolution began with that book. So throughout, one might say that the political aspirations and the Spiritista aspirations of Madero were fused. They were inseparable. They were inseparable. And I think it's not that he had this political career and then he had this secret life over here. It's that they were, although this was secret, he tried, it was kind of an open secret in Mexico City that he was a Spiritist, but he tried to keep this secret. He didn't want people to know.
He knew that it could be a problem for his political
in fact,
career.
it was a problem. But this is a very important point, that his modus operandi was to come up with a book and organize around the book. And, in the modern world, in our world, when we talk about books, we're usually talking about a business, the publishing industry, and there's agents, and there's editors, and distributors, and bookstores. He couldn't do it that way.
He didn't need the money.
Well, it wasn't the money, it was the government would confiscate it. The government would stop the printing presses. You couldn't sell a book like that in a bookstore.
It was a very repressive environment.
So he published this, I'm talking about his political book, La Sucesión Presidencial en 1910. He published it and immediately gave out free copies
before the government could
hundreds
confiscate
of journalists. Exactly. So it was like setting something in motion that you couldn't stop. So what's really interesting is that book is central to understanding the beginning of the 1910 revolution. The minute he had finished it, the spirits then he channeled said, now you will write the Spiritist Manual.
Well, our half hour for our first episode is over. C.M. Mayo, thank you so much for being with me.
Well, thank you. It's an honor.
And thank you for being with us. Be sure to check your listings for parts 2 and 3 of this 3-part series on the role of Spiritism in the Mexican Revolution.